The morning the corpse rose from the murky green water of the Grand Canal, Paris was still asleep beneath a lid of mist. A bargeman's pole had snagged on something soft, something that yielded before tearing free, and when he peered over the edge, he saw a face, pale as marble, hair drifting like a weed. By the time Maigret arrived, the fog had thickened into a wall, muffling the police whistles and turning the cobblestones slick beneath his boots. Somewhere a cafe door creaked open, spilling the smell of chicory coffee into the chill air. The inspector paused, pipe between his teeth, studying the slow circles widening across the canal's surface. Death was an old companion of his, but this one had patience in it, a kind of resigned quiet, as though the city itself were holding its breath. In that silence, that heavy, watchful silence, began the case that would haunt him more than any bullet or confession, the mystery of the woman no one claimed, the drowned whisper at the heart of the capital. Maigret's gaze drifted beyond the rippling canal toward the shuttered windows above the quays. So many secrets sleeping behind them, so many stories waiting for a knock at the door. And if you too find yourself drawn to the quiet unraveling of human puzzles, to the smoke, the rain, and the steady patience of truth, then follow us through these streets. Stay with us, share the trail, and subscribe to the cases that never let the soul rest easy. The next clue is already in the air. The mist lay heavy over Paris that morning, as if the city had been veiled in gauze. From the Quai de l'Arsenal to the Pont Morand, the fog thickened like unspun wool, swallowing the outlines of bridges and muffling the first tram bells of the day. It was 6:30 when the bargeman's cry echoed across the canal, a cry not of surprise, but of weary recognition. Paris had offered up another secret. By the time Maigret reached the water's edge, the fog had seeped into his clothes. His bowler hat glistened with dew. His overcoat smelled faintly of damp tobacco. A gendarme saluted him, boots slick with canal mud, and pointed toward the dark shape pulled against the embankment. Two men from the river patrol knelt beside it, their hands numb with cold, their faces turned away from the sight before them. A woman, they said, about 30. No identification. No handbag. No struggle. At least not one the water had left behind. Maigret struck a match, cupping it against the wind, and lit his pipe. The flame flared briefly, reflecting in the dead woman's open eyes before it guttered out. She had delicate features, not the coarse lines of the working class, nor the powdered perfection of the Montmartre girls. Her clothes were simple but well made, the fabric finer than what most women of her supposed means could afford. The lace at her wrist, that small torn remnant the bargeman had noticed, was Venetian. Not imitation. Real, the kind that never reached these quays without a story attached to it. "Did anyone see her fall?" Maigret asked, his voice low, almost a whisper to keep from disturbing the silence. "No, Chief," the sergeant replied. "Barge crew found her caught between the mooring posts. Said she looked like she'd been there since last night." Maigret nodded slowly. He crouched down, the pipe clenched in his teeth, and examined the woman's fingers. No ring. No marks of violence except a faint bruise beneath the chin, the kind that could have come from a hand or from the water's cruel patience. "Send her to the morgue," he said finally, "and keep the lace carefully." As the men lifted the stretcher, Maigret remained by the water, staring into the green surface where the fog swirled like breath. Across the canal, shutters began to open. A woman leaned from a window to shake out a rug, her movements indifferent. The city was waking, but for a few minutes longer, Maigret let himself stand in that in-between hour, when life and death, noise and quiet, had not yet decided who would win. He turned back toward the waiting car. Janvier, his young inspector, stood by the door, notebook ready. "You'll want me at the morgue, Chief?" "Later," Maigret said. "For now, talk to the bargemen, every one of them. Ask if anyone saw her last night. Someone must have noticed something, even a shadow." Janvier nodded and trotted off, eager, his breath rising like smoke. Maigret slid into the back seat. The driver hesitated, watching him through the mirror, uncertain whether to speak. "Quai des Orfèvres," Maigret murmured. The car moved through the fog, headlights carving tunnels of yellow into the grey. Maigret sat with his pipe unlit, fingers resting on his knee. A body in the canal was not rare. Paris had many ways of forgetting its lost souls, but there was something about this one. The stillness, the quiet refusal of the scene to explain itself, that pressed on him like an unsolved thought. At the quay, warmth greeted him in the form of stale coffee and damp wool. The offices smelled of ink, dust, and human weariness. A typist's machine clattered somewhere down the hall. Lucas, his dependable sergeant, appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup. "Found anything on her, Chief?" "Nothing, except a scrap of Venetian lace." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Venetian, you say? Then she wasn't from around here." "Maybe not, but Paris has a way of gathering foreigners. Some come for love, some for money, some because they have nowhere else to go." He moved toward the map on the wall, its surface dotted with pins and notes from a dozen cases. His finger traced the waterway from the Bastille lock toward the Seine. "Somewhere along this path," he said softly. "She met the wrong person." By mid-morning, the morgue report arrived. Cause of death: drowning, likely unconscious before immersion. No signs of struggle, no defensive. Wounds. Estimated time of death between midnight and 2. So she had entered the water while the city slept, perhaps from the quays, perhaps from a bridge. Suicide, some would suggest. But Maigret had learned not to believe in easy answers. The world was rarely kind enough to end a story so neatly. He visited the morgue himself that afternoon. The corridors smelled of carbolic and cold air. The attendant led him to a narrow room where the woman lay on a metal table, her hair neatly combed, her features softened by stillness. Maigret removed his hat. He stared at her for a long time, as though expecting her to open her eyes and tell him why she had chosen this ending, or why someone had chosen it for her. "Do you recognize her, Chief?" the attendant asked. Maigret shook his head. "No, but someone will." He left the morgue and walked aimlessly along the Seine, his collar turned up against the drizzle. Barges moved slowly under the bridges, their engines chugging with weary rhythm. The grey water reflected no colour, only the trembling ghost of the lamps above. Somewhere a violin played, faint, persistent, the kind of tune that clings to the air long after it ends. By the time he reached a café near Pont-Marie, the fog had lifted. Inside, the smell of coffee and frying butter welcomed him like an old friend. He sat at his usual corner table, ordered a calvados, and lit his pipe. The waiter nodded in recognition, but didn't disturb him. It was one of those establishments where silence was part of the service. A newspaper lay folded on the counter. The headlines spoke of politics and strikes, but nothing yet of the Canal. That would come tomorrow, when the reporters caught wind of it, when the city would invent stories to fill the void, the jealous lover, the runaway wife, the foreign spy. Maigret could already hear the whispers forming like smoke rings. Through the café window, he watched the people pass. Clerks, students, an old woman with a dog. Each face, anonymous, contained 100 lives he would never know. He wondered which of them might have seen her last. Which of them had heard the splash, perhaps from a bridge above, and turned away? He thought again of the lace at her wrist, that stubborn thread of beauty that had survived the water. It spoke of a past richer than her end. Someone had loved her once, or at least wanted her to appear loved. Someone had chosen her clothes with care. Someone had watched her vanish. When he finally rose to leave, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of metal and coal smoke. From somewhere near the river came the distant sound of church bells, slow and mournful. Maigret paused, pipe between his lips, and looked back toward the direction of the canal. He had seen many deaths in his time, violent, petty, desperate. But this one had the quiet dignity of something unfinished. A silence that demanded listening, not explanation. And in that silence, he thought he heard footsteps, faint, measured, deliberate, echoing in the fog. He turned. A man stood at the far corner of the street beneath a dripping umbrella, watching him. When their eyes met, the stranger adjusted his hat and walked away. Maigret stood motionless for a long time, the ember in his pipe dying to ash. The body had been found, but the story, he knew, had just begun. Rain resumed after nightfall, a thin, needling rain that stitched the streets together with a silver thread. Paris altered its face under such weather. The light in the shop windows took on the deep warmth of brandy, and the gutters ran with reflections that turned each doorway into a dark pool. Maigret walked home more slowly than usual, the day's damp having settled into his bones. He carried the image of the man with the umbrella the way one carries a phrase of music that refuses to end, the angle of the brim, the deliberate tempo of his steps, the brief adjustment of the hat when their eyes had met. Not the look of a passer-by, not the curiosity of a gawker. The man had looked as if he were measuring something, time, perhaps, or distance. At Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the market stalls had long since been taken down, leaving a scatter of crushed leaves, wet paper, and the smell of earth where crates of cabbages had been stacked. In their place, the rain left small mirrors. He could see himself in one for an instant, the heavy coat, the drooping brim, the pipe that refused to stay lit, before the reflection broke and he climbed the stairs to his apartment with a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. Madame Maigret had kept a pot on the corner of the stove and warmed it the moment she heard his key. The kitchen held the reassuring perfume of bay leaf and boiled potatoes. She did not ask questions at once. She waited until he had eaten a spoonful and set the bowl down, his hands cupped around it, for comfort more than heat. "Another case," she said gently. "A woman from the Arsenal lock," he answered, "without a name, without anything but a lace thread on her wrist." Madame Maigret's eyes lowered, not in sadness exactly, but in that attentive way she had when someone's misfortune entered the room like a draught. She placed a folded napkin by his elbow. "You will find her name." "Perhaps," he said. "There was a man watching this morning, an umbrella black as a raven's wing. He left the moment we noticed him." "A mourner, then," she suggested, though her tone knew the word was too simple. "Mourners do not measure their steps," he said. He kept the rain off his face as if he feared recognition more than the weather. "At breakfast tomorrow," she said, and did not press further. She touched his sleeve once and left him, with his soup and the ticking of the clock. He listened to the apartment settle, to the soft clink of china as she cleared away her own plate, to the whisper of the rain returning in a stronger mood. He had seen enough grief to know that it rarely wore such careful shoes. He slept as men sleep when their minds are impatient, dipping briefly below the surface and rising again at the slightest disturbance. Somewhere in the night he dreamed of canals, not the Parisian ones, but their ancestors, the green-blue corridors of another city where water was not a boundary, but a street. A woman's hair floated there like river grass, and an umbrella bobbed on the current, black and absurd as a beetle on its back. He woke before dawn with the shape of the dream still impressed upon him, dressed quietly, and left the apartment with the taste of strong coffee on his tongue. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was already there, coat dripping, cheeks bright with the cold. He had the zeal of the young, that quick-footed eagerness that made Maigret think of his own early days, when he'd believed the city could be persuaded to speak plainly if only the right questions were asked. "I've got the statements from the bargeman, Chief," Janvier said, shaking rain from his hat. "None of them saw her go in. One claims he heard a carriage past midnight on the Boulevard Bourdon, wheels moving too fast for the hour. Another remembers a woman's voice. Laughing, he says, but he laughs himself when he says it, like a man who knows memory is a stage performer." "And the lace?" "In your drawer," Janvier said. "I wrapped it in paper." They stood together at the window while the sky paled by slow degrees. The river had the sullen look of a creature woken too early. Across the water the roofs ran with rain. A newsboy shouted something about a ministerial scandal, the words breaking apart in the wind. "We'll start on the bridges," Maigret said. "Not for witnesses, there are none worth the asking, but for the feeling of them. A body chooses an entrance, or the one who arranges it chooses. There's a difference you can smell." They walked in the wet, their collars up, the umbrellas of other men bobbing around them like dark mushrooms. On the Pont Moreau, a lover's knot cut into the parapet had filled with water, a tiny basin reflecting a sliver of sky. On the footpath below, where the stone retains other people's steps, a faint scrape near the edge told its small, stubborn story. A heel, perhaps, or a suitcase dragged too close to the river's pull. Maigret crouched, touched the mark with a forefinger, and felt the grit gather beneath the nail. "Midnight to 2, he said. This would still have been damp then. "Suicide?" Janvier asked because it was his duty to ask. "Suicides rarely bother with umbrellas," Maigret said. "And if there was such a tidy man at her side, he would have held her by the elbow, not by the throat." They moved on, down to the towpath, where the smell of wet hemp and spilled coal thickened the air. Near the Arsenal lock, a watchman kept a hut that looked always on the verge of collapse, but never fell. He brewed a coffee the colour of tar and offered it to the policeman with a shrug that could be read as kindness or habit. "You work the night?" Maigret asked. "Sometimes," the watchman said. "Last night the rain did my work, kept people indoors." "Not everyone," Maigret said, and glanced at the man's boots. Clean. The floor of the hut showed tidier footprints than the mud outside. A careful fellow, then, or one who had stayed mostly still. "Did you see a gentleman with an umbrella this morning?" Maigret asked. The watchman scratched his chin and looked into the steam of his cup, as if the answer might be written there. "Gentlemen with umbrellas are not rare, Inspector. But yes, there was one who stood longer than the weather demanded. Thin, I think, a coat that fit too well for a dockside dawn, no hatband, he smoked, but daintily." "The direction he came from?" The watchman pointed, not toward the boulevard, where cabs rattled even now, but toward a narrow chain of alleys behind the warehouses, where water seeped up through stone, and things took longer to dry. They walked those alleys next. Laundry ropes sagged between windows, heavy with damp shirts. A woman shook a rug in the rain, more from despair than hope. Children in wooden clogs hopped canals of their own making between rivulets that ran along the curb. At a corner where the plaster had peeled away to expose old brick like bone, a small sign read, "Chambre meublée," by the week, by the month. The doorways smelled of cabbage and a kind of poverty that had made a habit of dignity. Maigret pressed the bell and waited. He never knocked at such places. The sound carried too much authority for rooms where authority was something endured. A concierge in a shawl peered at them through a cracked pane and allowed them in with the air of one who knew the police could not be kept out forever. Her eyes were quick and without surprise. The staircase creaked in polite protest as they climbed. "We're looking for a tenant who uses a black umbrella," Maigret said. "Thin, well-tailored coat, a man who smokes but does not enjoy it." "Monsieur likes riddles," the concierge said, not unkindly. "I could give you 10 such men by supper time, but there is one who fits too well. His name on the ledger is Signor Bianchi, spelled different each month, which makes it the same name. He comes and goes as if the stairs belong to him." "Room?" "Third floor, under the eaves. He is not in at this minute. He leaves before dawn sometimes when I pretend to sleep. There is patience in his footsteps." The door bore the mark of many keys, small crescents where metal met paint. Maigret stood a long time with his ear to it and heard only the rain moving under the roof. They did not force the lock yet. The uniformed men could make a mess before there was cause. Instead, he asked to see the ledger. The concierge brought it like a small ceremony. The name was there, twice in one, week, then absent for a month, then again, always with the same tidy hand that had learned to disguise itself by becoming careful. "He pays in cash?" Maigret asked. "How else would such a man pay?" the concierge said, and folded her arms to keep in her warmth. At the corner by the window, a tiny table held a pot of geraniums, the leaves glossy with the damp. The red of the flowers was such an insistence against the grey that Maigret felt momentarily ashamed of his intrusion. He thanked the woman and left, promising to send a man by to keep watch, which was the truth, dressed in reassuring cloth. On the street again, Janvier blew on his fingers and said, "The name is nothing. We'll find a dozen Bianchi between Gare de Lyon and the next café." "Names are useful even when they are borrowed," Maigret said. "They tell you what a man longs to be mistaken for." They made a slow circuit, letting the rain do their thinking for them. The umbrella man was no ruffian. He would not hide in the obvious places. He would find a café whose windows blurred with steam and sit just long enough to be part of the furniture, then vanish while the waiter's back was turned. It was a habit with such men, the art of being almost seen. At noon the fog relented, and the city presented itself washed and sullen. They returned to the quay where Lucas had gathered a small harvest of rumours. A violinist at the Café des Artistes had mentioned a woman with foreign perfume who sometimes left after midnight by the side door. A waiter had seen her once with a man who kept his hat on indoors. The description was artless, but telling. Respectability practised like a trick. "The Café des Artistes," Maigret repeated, as if tasting a memory. He had walked past it 100 times. It kept late hours and later conversations. Men played at genius there, and women at indifference. "We'll go tonight," he said. "Meanwhile, send someone to sit on the furnished room, not to arrest, only to understand the rhythm of his comings and goings." The afternoon passed in the paperwork the world demands, even from those who dislike its chatter. Forms were signed that pretended certainty. Messages were sent that carried only questions. A wire came from Venice in a bureaucrat's voice, promising nothing and asking for everything. He folded it in half and tucked it in a drawer with the lace. Evening brought the first honest hunger of the day. He ate a plate of stew at a small place near the Place Dauphine, where the napkins were thin but clean. The owner kept a radio the size of a dictionary on a shelf and turned it low when Maigret came in, as if sound itself should defer to an inspector's thoughts. Outside, the sky held the last dull light like a secret. The Café des Artistes had its own climate. Heat rose from the crowd and fogged the mirrors so that faces wore halos of breath. The violinist played with the weary confidence of a man whose living depended less on talent than on endurance. Conversations overlapped until they formed a single river of talk in which bits of proper nouns gleamed like fish turning in the current. He and Janvier took a table near the back where the draught nudged the smoke toward the ceiling. They ordered nothing stronger than coffee and waited for the room to forget them. In such places the trick was to be the one who did not look bored. After a time the waiter began to address them by a nod rather than a question. The door opened and closed at first with nothing to show for itself but a shrug of cold air, then with the arrival of a woman whose perfume found them even in the far corner. Not the cheap sweetness of department stores. Lilac, lifted out of season, the way money can drag spring into autumn. Her face was not the face from the slab, but it had known that face. You could tell by the way she looked at the tables, searching for an absence rather than a presence. She spoke to the violinist between songs with the familiarity of someone who had lent him a cigarette on more than one night when the hour wore thin. When she passed their table, Maigret smelled not just lilac but the tinny trace of rain drying on wool. He did not stop her. He watched the door, and then the umbrella man came in. No umbrella now. He had left it somewhere to keep his hands free. The same coat, the same tidy poverty of movement. He kept his hat on until the last possible second and removed it only when he felt eyes upon him, which is to say, he removed it because it would have been suspicious not to. He placed it on the rack as one might place evidence into a drawer. He did not choose a corner. He chose the middle, where men are least remembered. His eyes met Maigret's for the span of 2 heartbeats, and in that time both of them told the other what could not be said aloud. I have been seen. I am not yet speaking. Janvier straightened like a young dog catching a scent, but Maigret placed a hand flat on the table. Not yet. The room was their witness, and witnesses prefer a story to an arrest. The umbrella man took a chair that faced neither the door nor the back, but the window where the rain made ghosts of passers-by. He ordered a coffee in a voice that had learned its Paris in the mouths of other men. When the woman with the lilac passed him, he did not look up, which was all the looking up that was needed. He waited until the violinist had retuned a string and a laugh had gone up at the far end of the room over a joke with no beginning. Then he rose, left a coin, and reached for his hat with a care that turned the gesture into a signal. Maigret let him go first. He waited the appropriate seconds, then stood, tugged his coat straight, and nodded to Janvier. The young inspector moved to the door by way of the mirror, as he had been taught, watching without staring. The street outside received them with the chill of an empty church. The umbrella man did not hurry. He respected the rain and kept to the awnings where the drops fell in a steady curtain. Past the tobacconist, past the bakery, with its shutter already halfway down, into the narrow that the concierge had pointed to in the morning, where the cobbles remembered other feet. He paused under a lamp whose halo brought water out of the air like breath from a sleeping animal. Maigret closed the distance until he could hear the other man's draw on a cigarette, the small hiss, the softer exhale. He was close enough to smell the tobacco, which was foreign without being exotic, a careful choice meant to pass unnoticed by anyone who had never left home. "Good evening, Signor Bianchi," Maigret said, and the name lay between them like a card turned face up. The man did not start. He adjusted the brim of his hat in that same tender, practiced motion and let his gaze travel from Maigret to Janvier and back again. The cigarette burned, forgotten in his fingers. When he spoke, his French had the faintest burr of a city with water in its vowels. "Inspector," he said, as if they had an appointment. Somewhere behind them a door opened and closed with the sound of someone deciding to keep a secret. The rain marked time against the lamp-post. From the direction of the canal came a bell, a single stroke that did not care about men or their troubles. "We will talk," Maigret said, "but not here." "As you wish," the man replied. He dropped the cigarette and crushed it so neatly that the ember went out without a complaint. He did not look back toward the café. He did not look toward the furnished room under the eaves. He looked at the river, at that dark ribbon that had carried a woman into his morning, and then at the inspector, whose patience had found him. And then, not by flight, but by a movement so modest it almost failed to exist, he stepped sideways into the shadow of the doorway and was gone, leaving behind the brief breath of lilac that did not belong to him at all. When he returned that night, the clocks of Paris were already chiming 10, each toll softened by rain sliding off the slate roofs. The stairwell smelled faintly of varnish and soup, and from the Maigret's flat came the domestic music of plates being stacked, of a radio turned low so as not to wake the neighbor's child. He hung his coat on its peg, the water still dripping from the hem, and felt for the moment as though he were stepping from one world into another, the grey labyrinth of the city into a room that held warmth as a principle. Madame Maigret looked up from the ironing board where she was pressing napkins with the meticulousness of someone who found peace in small perfections. "You're late," she said, but her tone carried no reproach. "There was a man with an umbrella," Maigret replied, untying his scarf. "The same I saw this morning at the canal." "And you spoke with him?" "He spoke enough," Maigret said, drawing out the words between puffs of pipe smoke. "He knew I would find him, which means he has been waiting. That's what troubles me. A guilty man hides. A thoughtful one waits." She folded a napkin, aligning the corners like closing a book. "You look as if the case will take root inside you. Eat something before it grows too deep." He smiled faintly and accepted the plate she brought, a portion of stew reheated, the flavors settled into quiet harmony. While he ate, she poured him wine and sat opposite, her hands folded on the table, watching him with that mixture of affection and curiosity reserved for those who have long since given up trying to change a person and instead have learned to read his silences. "You remember, Jules," she said after a time, "that other case, the one in Nevers, the miller's daughter?" "You told me then that truth sometimes arrives disguised as pity. I think this will be the same." He looked up, surprised by the precision of her remark. "Why pity?" "Because you already feel it," she said simply. "Your face wears it. The woman in the canal, she's become someone you must understand before you can bury her. And the man with the umbrella, he's not the villain you expect." Maigret leaned back, pipe resting between his fingers, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like thought made visible. "You speak as though you were there." "No," she said softly. but I've lived long enough beside you to know how these stories end. It won't be an arrest that satisfies you. It will be the moment when you see why it had to happen." He gave a small, weary laugh. "You make it sound as though I search for poetry instead of evidence." "Perhaps they are the same thing," she answered. The rain intensified against the shutters, a hush that filled the pauses between their words. He thought of the umbrella man's calm voice, the cigarette extinguished with care, the way he had not denied his false name. Guilt, when it is real, always trembles. This man's composure had the steadiness of mourning. "I'll go back to the Café des Artistes tomorrow," he said. "The woman with the lilac perfume. She knew the victim. I could see it." "Then you'll find her?" Madame Maigret said, rising to clear the plates. "But remember what I told you. This one won't end with a handcuff." He watched her move about the kitchen, her figure framed by the yellow light of the lamp. Domestic gestures had their own grace. They anchored him more firmly than any uniform ever had. When at last he went to bed, he lay awake, listening to her quiet breathing beside him, and to the distant river sliding unseen through the city, carrying secrets with the patience of centuries. The next morning, dawn was a pale bruise behind the clouds. Maigret was out before the milk carts began their rounds. The streets smelled of wet coal and bakery smoke. He stopped at the tobacconist on Rue de Rivoli for matches, exchanged a few words about the weather, and continued toward the Latin Quarter, where the café waited. The city, in its half-light, resembled a thought he could almost recall but not quite name. Inside the Café des Artistes, the night's debris still lingered. Overturned chairs, lipstick stains on glasses, the violin resting on its side like a wounded bird. The owner, a man with eyes the colour of tea, was sweeping. He straightened when he recognized the inspector. "You were here last night," the man said cautiously. "I was," Maigret replied. "And so was a woman. Dark hair, lilac perfume. You know her?" The owner hesitated. "We all know her. Clara Marini, Italian, I think. Used to sing before the war. Comes in when she feels lonely." The name hung in the air, a soft chime that matched too well the note he'd heard whispered in his dream. "Marini," he repeated. "She lives nearby?" "On Rue du Temple. But she hasn't been in today. She'll come tonight." "She always comes when it rains." "Then I'll return when the weather obliges us again," Maigret said. He placed a coin on the counter, more for conversation than coffee, and left. By afternoon the rain kept its promise. He sat in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the lace fragment on his desk beside the telegram from Venice. Each time he glanced at it he saw the water's quiet defiance. Lucas entered with a folder. "Nothing new from the Italian consulate," Lucas said. "They're pretending not to recognize the name Morini." "They recognize it," Maigret said. "They just don't wish to remember." He wrote Clara Morini's name on a scrap of paper, placed it beside the lace, and watched the two objects coexist, a word and a thread, both delicate, both bearing witness. Evening again. The café was alive once more, the smoke and laughter stitched together like cloth. Clara Marini sat at a table near the piano, a glass of Pernod before her, her gaze unfocused as if she were watching a scene invisible to the rest. When Maigret approached, she did not startle. She looked up with the calm of someone who had expected him eventually, the way a singer expects the next note of her song. "You are Inspector Maigret," she said, her voice carrying the music of another country. "I am," he answered. "You knew the woman from the Canal?" Clara nodded slowly, the motion drawing light across her earrings. "She was my friend once, in Venice, long ago. We sang in the same theatre, until her voice broke. She came to Paris to begin again. Her name? Clara also, Clara Marini, my name before it became convenient to borrow another. She took mine to travel safely. I took hers to be forgotten. Maigret felt the room tilt slightly, as though the air had changed shape. You mean the dead woman is the real Clara Marini? Yes, she said. And the man with the umbrella was her husband? He followed her here. But if you arrest him, you will destroy what little mercy remains. He studied her face, the careful poise, the eyes that refused both guilt and innocence. Mercy is not mine to measure, he said. Then you'll find nothing but grief, she whispered. She rose before he could stop her, leaving the glass half full and the scent of lilac behind. Through the window he saw her umbrella open like a dark flower against the rain. When he returned home, Madame Maigret was mending a tear in one of his shirts. She looked up without surprise. "You've learned her name," she said, though he hadn't spoken. "Yes," he said quietly, "and I've learned that I might already know how this story ends." She threaded her needle, the silver glint catching the lamplight. "Then you understand what I meant. Not every crime asks for punishment. Some only ask to be understood." He sat down beside her, the rhythm of her stitching steadying his thoughts. Outside, the river swelled with the evening's rain, carrying reflections of windows and lamps. Somewhere, an umbrella moved through the night, and Maigret felt again that peculiar ache his wife had named before he could. Pity, simple and unanswerable. The lace on his desk would wait, the telegram too. Tomorrow he would trace the husband, but tonight he allowed himself the rare grace of uncertainty. In the quiet of the apartment, amid the faint scent of starch and wool, he finally saw the truth of her prediction. This case would not end in a cell or a courtroom. It would end, as most human things do, in the grey territory between love and loss. The clock struck 11. He rose, kissed his wife's hair, and stood for a moment at the window. The city shimmered beneath its veil of rain, innocent as long as one didn't look too closely. And Maigret, watching the darkness settle upon the Seine, knew that whatever he found next would not bring satisfaction, only the small peace of knowing why silence sometimes floats where words cannot. Paris, on the morning after that conversation, wore its habitual disguise of indifference. The streets glistened from a night of rain, and the air carried the scent of coal smoke and wet iron. Bicycles rattled past, wheels slicing puddles into patterns that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Yet beneath the rhythm of another working day, Maigret felt a change, a shift in the unseen current of the case. The city had begun to whisper back. He arrived at the Café des Artistes just as the first cups of coffee were being served. The place, stripped of its nocturnal glamour, looked smaller in daylight. Chairs were stacked near the bar. The mirrors, streaked by steam and fingerprints, reflected a tired version of the room. A waitress polished cutlery with the mechanical patience of someone who had stopped expecting stories from the faces she served. "Inspector," she said, recognizing him from the night before. "You're early. The café isn't open yet." "Then I'll wait," Maigret replied, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "I'm not here for coffee this time." He crossed the narrow room to the back staircase, and the one that led to the rented rooms above. The waitress hesitated, her cloth frozen in mid-air. "If it's about the lodger," she said finally, "he's gone, left before dawn." "So soon?" "He paid last night, cash. I found the key on the counter when I came in. Didn't hear him leave, but then nobody ever does. The floorboards up there creak for everyone except him." Maigret nodded, pocketed his pipe, and began to climb. Each step complained softly beneath his weight, and the air grew colder with height, carrying the stale perfume of smoke, wine, and old wallpaper. The corridor was narrow, the kind that seemed designed for secrets. Doors lined one side like closed eyes. At the end, a single window overlooked the grey ribbon of the canal. The umbrella man's room, or Signor Bianchi's, as the ledger still called him, was easy to find. The lock yielded after a quiet turn of the key left by Janvier during the night watch. Inside, the air was still warm, as if it remembered someone's recent presence. A bed neatly made, though the sheets retained the ghost of a body. A table with a water glass half full. A cigarette end pressed so cleanly into the ashtray it might have been a signature. On the chair, folded with deliberate care, a newspaper from 2 days ago, Italian, La Stampa, its pages opened to an article about Venice's rising waters. Maigret stood in the centre of the small room and breathed slowly. He had walked into many rooms of the dead and the guilty, and each had its own temperature, its own silence. This one held neither panic nor haste. It was the calm of someone who knew he would not return. He opened the drawer of the table. Inside lay a single photograph. 2 women standing beside a piano, one smiling directly at the camera, the other caught in profile, laughing. Clara and Clara, perhaps. The edges of the photograph had been worn thin by handling, and there was a faint scent of lilac still clinging to the paper, as if the memory itself had perfume. Next to the photograph lay the half-burned remains of a letter. He picked it up carefully, brushing away the ash that had fused with the ink. Only fragments remained. Never meant to hurt her. The bridge that night. And, if she forgives me, I shall go back to Venice. He held the paper close to the window, the grey light revealing the tremor in the handwriting. Not fear, but grief. From below came the faint clatter of dishes, the distant voice of the waitress humming to herself, unaware that above her head the city's quiet tragedy was unfolding line by line. Janvier arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a fresh notebook and the scent of wet wool. No sign of him at the station, Chief. If he's left the city, he didn't take a train. He hasn't gone far, Maigret said. He's tied to this place by something stronger than fear. Guilt, perhaps. Or love. Janvier moved toward the bed. Neat for a fugitive. Yes, Maigret murmured. Too neat. He wanted us to see this. He walked to the window and looked out. From here, the canal could be seen curving away beneath the iron bridges, a pale mirror for the sky. The same water that had carried the dead woman now carried his thoughts. Notice the angle, Maigret said quietly. From this window, you can see the very spot where she was found. Janvier leaned beside him. So he watched. Or remembered, Maigret said. Some people can't leave the scene of their remorse. He turned from the view, his coat brushing against the table. The movement disturbed a small envelope tucked beneath the lamp. It was sealed with a faint smudge of red wax, unaddressed. Inside was a folded sheet written in the same hand as the burned letter. He read it in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly as the words took hold. Inspector Maigret, you will come here because I wished you to. You will find nothing that points to me, and yet everything that explains her. She was not a criminal, she was weary. The city was too loud for her kind of heart. If you must judge, judge gently. I shall remain where the fog is kindest. No signature, but it did not need one. The ink itself carried his voice. Maigret refolded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. The kind of note left not as confession but as plea. Below, the cafe was beginning to fill again with its afternoon customers, clerks, musicians and women with the look of those who had once been admired and now simply wished to be seen. Life continued its routine, indifferent to what the floor above had contained. Janvier leaned on the doorframe. "You think he'll come back?" Maigret shook his head. "No, but he'll be near. Men like him always circle the memory of their mistakes. He'll need to see how we bury her, how Paris pretends to forget." The younger inspector hesitated. "And the woman, the one who borrowed the name?" "Clara," Maigret said. "She'll come tonight too. Not here, perhaps, but somewhere close. The living and the dead share the same silence for a while after a tragedy. They listen to what the city will say of them." He glanced again around the small room. The care of it, the restraint. "Send for the photographer. Tell them to capture everything exactly as it stands. This is not evidence, Janvier. It's testimony." When the men arrived, Maigret remained by the window, watching the river of umbrellas moving below. For a brief instant, one black umbrella turned the corner, the angle of its tilt unmistakable. He pressed his hand to the glass, though he knew the figure would be gone by the time the photographer raised his camera. That evening, back at headquarters, Lucas handed him a file marked with the seal of the Italian police. Inside was a thin dossier, passport photographs, theatre programs, and a report dated 4 years earlier from Venice. Subject: Clara Marini, soprano. Disappeared following domestic incident. Husband: Enrico Bianchi, violinist, no charges filed. Maigret read in silence, the rain drumming faintly against the windows of his office. The pieces fit, though not comfortably. A woman who fled, a man who followed, another woman who shared her name, and between them all the echo of music and sorrow. When he finally rose, the gaslights along the Seine were already trembling in the mist. He paused on the bridge, pipe in hand, staring at the water that connected everything, the canals of Venice, the arteries of Paris, the current that carried memory from one city to another. He thought again of the letter, "If you must judge, judge gently." It was not a criminal's farewell, it was a request for compassion, which in the inspector's experience was the hardest thing for the law to grant. As he turned toward home, the clock of Notre Dame began to strike midnight. Each chime rolled through the fog like a measured breath. Somewhere a violin began to play, hesitant, trembling, as though the night itself had decided to give voice to the confession that words could no longer bear. Maigret walked on, the sound following him like a shadow, and knew with a kind of weary clarity that the case was no longer about guilt or innocence. It had become something else, elegy written across 2 cities and a canal that kept its secrets faithfully, at least until dawn. The fog returned to Paris like an old habit that could not be broken. It rose from the Seine in soft, restless waves, wrapping the quays and bridges until even the nearest lamp-post became a smudge of yellow in the white murk. The bells of Saint-Gervais rang half-heartedly, their sound absorbed by the air before reaching the next street. It was in that half-world, neither night nor morning, but that Maigret found himself walking again, coat-collar turned high, pipe clenched like an anchor between his teeth. He moved without hurry, yet every step carried intent. The case had begun to thicken around him like the fog itself, not obscuring, but softening, making boundaries uncertain. Clara Marini, the true one, lay in the morgue awaiting a name that Paris would soon forget. Her husband, Enrico Bianchi, had vanished into the grey. The other Clara, the borrowed one, drifted through the cafes like a ghost of the living, and Maigret, caught between them, listened to a silence that seemed to murmur with unfinished words. He reached the arsenal lock. The same bargemen were at work, their movements slow and practised, their voices muted by the mist. From somewhere beyond, a dog barked once, then twice, then stopped. The water beneath the bridge glowed faintly with reflections of gaslight, a moving mirror where nothing kept its shape for long. A figure emerged from the fog. Janvier, breath visible in the cold. "No sign of him yet, Chief," he said. "But—" The concierge swears she heard footsteps near the furnished room around midnight. Couldn't tell from which direction. "Footsteps can be memory playing tricks," Maigret said. "When the fog is thick, the city invents company." Still, he followed Janvier to the narrow lane behind the café. The puddles were deep enough to reflect the windows above, yellow squares that quivered like lanterns trapped in milk. The door to the room stood locked, the keyhole dark. No sound came from within. They waited in silence, a drip from the gutter, a cartwheel turning somewhere far off, the faint toll of a bell marking an hour no one cared to count. Then, from the direction of the canal, came the echo of a voice, faint, measured, speaking words neither of them could discern. Janvier stiffened. "Hear that?" Maigret nodded, gesturing for quiet. The voice continued, closer now, but still softened by the fog. It was a man's voice, low, deliberate. The rhythm of someone speaking to himself rather than to others. Then a pause, and a second voice. A woman's this time, replying softly, uncertainly. They followed the sound, moving past the café's back wall until the alley opened onto the canal path. The mist had grown denser here, lying thick upon the water. Two silhouettes stood near the railing, one tall, one slight, facing each other like actors at the end of a play. The taller figure leaned forward, hands gripping the iron rail. The other remained motionless, her posture that of resignation rather than fear. The fog swirled around them, distorting edges, making the scene unreal. Maigret stopped a few paces away. "Monsieur Bianchi," he said quietly. The man turned slowly. His hat brim was wet with condensation, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. For a moment he looked at the inspector as though he had been expecting him all along. The woman beside him, the surviving Clara, lowered her gaze. "So you found me," Bianchi said. His voice had the calm of someone who has already spoken his last truth. "I hoped you would. I wanted to be seen once more before I disappeared completely." "Disappear?" Maigret asked. "You've already done that once, in Venice." A faint smile flickered across the man's lips. Venice was different. There, the water carries its dead out to sea. Here, it holds them, as if unwilling to let go. Clara raised her head then, her face pale and luminous in the mist. "He came to me this morning," she said. "Said he couldn't bear the thought of her lying alone in a foreign city. He wanted to see where she was found." Bianchi's eyes drifted toward the water. "She wanted freedom, Inspector, not from me, but from the world that demanded too much of her. When her voice failed, everything failed. I followed her not to punish her, but to remember what we were before the silence began." The fog thickened again, and for a moment Maigret could barely see their outlines. It was as though the mist itself were listening, unwilling to let the words escape too soon. "You didn't kill her?" Maigret said finally. "No," Bianchi replied. "But I watched her go. I saw her standing on the bridge, the lace around her wrist catching the light like a promise. I should have stopped her. Instead I stood there, thinking she wanted solitude. I didn't understand that solitude was already the death she'd chosen." Maigret said nothing. There were no procedures for moments like this, no report that could hold the weight of regret. Behind him, Janvier shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to act or to fade into the fog. "What do you expect me to do?" Maigret asked quietly. Nothing, Bianchi said. You'll write your report. You'll say she fell. You'll say the husband left the country. And you'll be right. I will leave tonight, but before I go I needed to hear her name one last time spoken without pity. Clara stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. Enrico, you mustn't. He turned to her, and for a brief instant the hardness in his face dissolved. You kept her name when she could not. That was kindness, not theft. Keep it still if you wish. The fog drew closer, swallowing the three of them until the gaslight became a distant glow. Maigret watched as Bianchi's figure merged with the mist, then reappeared, then was gone altogether, not fleeing, simply receding into the grey as if returning to his element. When the silence settled again, Clara was crying quietly, her tears indistinguishable from the moisture on her cheeks. Maigret offered her his handkerchief. She accepted it without a word. "Will you arrest him?" she asked finally. "For what?" Maigret replied. "For grief? For love's cowardice. The law is clear only when the heart is not." They stood for a while by the water. The canal moved sluggishly, carrying bits of debris that glinted like small ghosts. Somewhere a whistle blew, a barge signalling its passage through the lock. The sound faded, leaving behind the soft rhythm of dripping water and distant footsteps. Janvier came up beside him. "Should I send word to headquarters?" Maigret shook his head. "Not yet. Let the fog clear first. It's still telling the story." They began to walk back toward the lighted street. Behind them the mist thickened once more, erasing the shapes of bridge, rail, and water, until all that remained was sound. The faint whisper of a woman's voice, carried by the wind, repeating words that might have been song or prayer or nothing at all. By the time they reached the corner, Maigret stopped and looked back. The fog parted just enough for him to glimpse the place where Bianchi had stood. Empty now, but somehow still occupied by the weight of presence. He lit his pipe, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his face, and exhaled slowly. She wasn't running from him, he murmured. She was running from the echo of her own song. Janvier didn't reply. Some truths he had learned were best left unrecorded. At the Quai des Orfèvres, later that night, Maigret wrote his report in silence. He used the formal language the ministry preferred. Subject found deceased, probable suicide, no evidence of foul play. Yet each word felt like a lie told for mercy's sake. When he finished, he placed the sheet atop the stack of unsolved cases, lit another match, and watched the smoke curl upward like a ghost trying to escape through the ceiling. Outside, the fog still pressed against the windows, dense and luminous. Somewhere within it, he imagined Bianchi walking beside the canal, the umbrella once more above his head, fading step by step into the white oblivion that protects the weary. Maigret closed his eyes. The city, he thought, would remember nothing by morning, but he would. The voices in the fog speaking of love, guilt, and the quiet cruelty of understanding too late. He reached for the telegram from Venice again, unfolded it, and stared at the smudged line. "Do not judge her." He smiled faintly. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "I never did." Morning came with a thin frost that stitched the rooftops in pale thread. The river ran dull as pewter beneath the bridges, and the chimneys of the Ile Saint-Louis breathed a slow, domestic smoke. Maigret reached the Quai des Orfèvres before the typists, letting himself in with the taciturn nod of the night porter. His office wore the old smell, ink, wool, cold pipe ash, as if it had been waiting without impatience. On the desk, under the paperweight shaped like a paperweight and nothing else, lay a buff envelope with a scarlet seal half rubbed away by travel. The stamp said Venezia. The hand was official without warmth. He did not sit before opening it. A creak of wax, a careful slide of pages, thin sheets that had learned the habit of diplomacy. The covering note came first, from an attaché whose name arrived with the stiffness of a collar. The consulate regretted the delay. The matter of Signora Morini was known to them in outline, but not in shame, and they enclosed a letter recovered from a teacher at the conservatory, La Fenice, the proud, the ruinous, the phoenix that burned and burned again. The attaché's phrasing dressed grief in Foreign Office tailoring. Yet between the lines, a human breath had escaped. He laid the official sheet aside and turned to the letter. The paper had yellowed at the edges and smelt faintly of lamp oil, as if it had been written in a room where the light trembled. The hand was steady, the Italian slanting like a remembered song. Maigret read slowly, eyes narrowing, the pipe forgotten in his fingers. Inspector, though I write without the right to address you, I do so because I have feared silence more than scandal. Clara had a voice that made the lamps seem to warm, and the audience sit as if holding their coats closed over their chests. Then an illness came, nothing dramatic, a winter cough that would not leave. Doctors said rest. She insisted on rehearsals. Her upper notes, how do you say in French, the heights, grew thin, like glass just before it shatters. She sang once on an evening of fog, and did not finish. She walked off not in anger, not in tears, but with a kind of relieved shame, if that exists. From that night, she wore a modest coat. She stood at the Zattere as if the water could carry her somewhere her name would not echo. When she told me she would go to Paris, I gave her my own address book and wept where she could not see. The man Bianchi loved her badly but faithfully. He is no villain. If there is guilt, it belongs to those who applaud too hard and then turn away when the voice that fed them wants bread. Do not judge her, do not judge him, the world already has. I sign myself with my first name only. I am Antonio. The last line was a small defiance. Men like Antonio spent their lives signing other men's triumphs. Maigret stood at the window and let the grey of the river cool the heat in his face. In the letter's plainness, he recognized a truth he had met before in rooms, with the curtains half drawn, the little deaths that precede the large one, the way an identity fails a person long before the body follows. He sat then, folded the letter with the care given to a bandage, and drew toward him the map he kept not for display but for remembering. A pencil trace ran from the double circle marked Venezia to the spider of lines that meant Milan, then the long hinge of the mountains, the descent through winter fields toward Paris, trains like corridors, country stations where the tea was the colour of rainwater, a customs clerk with a chalk that left innocent crosses on valises. One could throw away a name on such a journey. One could pick up another if a friend, say, placed her own in your hand. Lucas entered without ceremony, as was his privilege, and stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt as if steadying his patience there. "A packet from the Gare de Lyon," he said, placing a claim stub on the desk. "Left luggage. The label matches a description we had from a porter. Small trunk, no initials, cord, not rope. It's hers, Chief. It was never collected." "Who asked them to look?" "I did," Lucas said. "I thought of the way she arrived. People who intend to stay bring 2 trunks. People who intend to begin again bring 1 and hope to grow another out of the new life." He had a way of saying things that made them sound unremarkable and true. Maigret nodded. "Let's fetch it." They went together, collars up, the breath of the station announcing itself before the doors, the smell of coal and steam, orange peels trodden flat by boots, a mother steadying a child with one hand while balancing a jug with the other. The left luggage room had the careful melancholy of any place where the past can be retrieved by number. The clerk, a man whose moustache seemed to do most of his talking for him, produced the trunk with a grunt of doubtful pride. It was lighter than expected. The cord had been retied by someone who believed knots could hold back time. A screwdriver did what the cord could not. Inside lay a life shrunk to fit, 2 dresses folded with love and habit, a pair of shoes with the nap of their velvet brushed the wrong way as though they had been placed in haste, a roll of music swollen by damp, and at the bottom a small tin that had once held lozenges and now held memory, a locket with a faded miniature of a Venetian bell tower, a theatre programme with the printed confidence of better nights, and a letter addressed to C. Marini in an unfamiliar hand. He opened this last with the same reluctance he would have felt at a confessional. The French was good but not native, the tone delicate as breath on glass. "Clara, if Paris is kind, write to me at the café with the red awning by the salute. I have told them you are my cousin. They will pass any message under that name. I cannot send money. I can send luck and my voice in your ear when the city is too loud. Remember the alley where we hid as girls and the shop, with the cracked bell on Fondamenta delle Zattere. If you make a friend, let him be a quiet man. If you make a promise, keep it to yourself. Your A. No surname," as if the initial were safer than the truth. He placed the note beside Antonio's letter. Their 2 voices did not contradict, only braided. He looked at the music roll, the top sheet a valse lente by some forgotten composer, the margins annotated in a hand that had wanted to make beauty obedient and could not. In one corner, a smear where a tear had fallen and dried to a roughness the finger could feel. Back at the quay, he spread the objects on his desk and let them speak. The little tin, the letters, the printed programme with a date that placed her failure 2 winters earlier than the worst of the rumours. He imagined her purchase of the trunk behind a glass that reflected her borrowed name back at her as she promised the shopkeeper with a smile that she would be sending for a larger one once she had settled in. He imagined her first week in Montmartre, the rooms with beds that remembered other bodies, the cafés where the saucers were thicker than the cups, the polite indifference that keeps the poor from going mad. In the afternoon he paid a call to the consulate. Their building had cool corridors that smelt of polish and water brought in from a courtyard where a fountain believed it was in Rome. A man in a grey suit received him with the suavity of a necessary inconvenience. "You have our letter, Inspector," the man said, showcasing his French like a groomed moustache. "I have it," Maigret said. "It speaks of mercy." The attaché smiled a small smile that knew its own courage. "We do not put mercy in writing. We enclose letters that mention it." "And the husband?" A pause as if he were choosing a wine. "Signor Bianchi is known. He has never been charged. He has taught, here and there, provincial orchestras, student rooms. He is a poor man who loved a famous woman that the world ceased to find useful. These are not crimes, even where I come from." "Your file mentions a domestic incident," Maigret said. The attaché arranged the blotter square with the desk. "2 people breaking as slowly as a chandelier loses its light. It made a noise. The neighbours were patriotic, that is all." When he left, the fountain muttered behind him in Italian, water's old language. On the street he felt Paris again, a tram bell, the cries of a seller of roasted chestnuts, the damp that creeps into wool no matter how tightly one buttons it. He walked without hurry to a small café near the river, ordered a calvados because it was what a man ordered when his thoughts needed straightening, and took out Antonio's letter once more. He read the sentence about the upper notes thinning, and thought of a bridge at night, a woman's breath turning to mist, a lace thread shining as if it ignored the darkness. It was not the husband's hand that had pushed her. It was the hand of a silence no one had taught her to bear. The day folded into evening. At headquarters, Janvier had left a note of his own, written in the round hand of a man more at home with questions than with pen nibs. The Café des Artistes crowded, the woman called Clara in attendance, speaking to the violinist in undertones, the umbrella man not seen. Maigret placed the note among the others, the way a fisherman lays his net in the shape of the river's bed. Close to 9, a messenger boy came breathless up the stair, cap in hand, cheeks apple red with the cold. He carried a flimsy form whose words were blurred not by haste, but by the paper itself, as if telegrams were designed to look like rumour. From Venice again, but not Antonio this time. Someone signing with a rank instead of a name. Be discreet. Morini matter touches persons of consideration. A visitor from our embassy arrives Paris tomorrow to confer. The boy waited for a coin. Maigret found one in his pocket, more than necessary, less than kindness. He stood long at the window, Paris softening into its nocturne. The lamps along the quays drew trembling ladders upon the water. Somewhere a barge groaned against its mooring like a tired animal adjusting in sleep. He thought of how canals in one city mirrored canals in another, the way two mirrors facing each other show the same corridor forever. Venice carried its tragedies to the lagoon, where salt softened them. Paris kept its water inside, as if unwilling to let suffering wash away. He took his hat and went out, letting the cold decide his route. At the morgue, the attendant had draped a more respectful sheet over the body. He lifted it back just enough to see the face again. Death had not made her grand, it had made her smaller, a person, returned to the size of her own sorrow. He put the sheet back, smoothing it as if tucking in a child. On the ledger he wrote the name at last, Clara Morini, in his careful schoolboy script, as though good handwriting might compensate for a life that had not been kind. When he came up into the night, the fog had not returned, but its memory remained in the chill. A cab clattered past, horse steaming, driver hunched in his cape. He walked toward the river and paused on a bridge where the balustrade gathered drops and offered them one by one to the Seine. The city was a patient instrument. It could be made to sing if one knew where to place the fingers. He thought of Bianchi, somewhere near, walking without umbrella for once, letting the damp have him. He thought of the other Clara, her borrowed name now heavier than her coat. He thought of the attaché's phrase, persons of consideration, as if grief required permission to move between capitals. The bell of a distant church tolled an hour he did not count. When the last vibration faded, he turned back toward the quay with the quiet resolve of a man who has chosen his light. Tomorrow there would be talk, dressed as courtesy, and he would be asked to lift his hat to secrets. That too was part of the work. For tonight he kept the letters in his inner pocket, where they warmed faintly against his heart. At the corner by the water a figure paused, recognizing him without surprise. The woman with lilac in her wake raised a hand not to greet, but to steady herself against the air. "You have her name now," she said. "Yes," he answered. "And will that change anything?" "It will let her be buried with fewer lies," he said. "Sometimes that is what the living can give." She nodded as if accepting a price and stepped away into the darker street where names do not travel. He watched until the sound of her heels was lost to the river's patient sigh. When he re-entered the quay, the porter was stoking the stove for the long hours. On Maigret's desk, the Venetian envelope lay where he had left it, empty now, the red seal broken like a waxen wound. He tapped his pipe on the ashtray and, for once, did not fill it again. In the stillness of the room, the letters rustled faintly, as if the canals themselves were speaking in paper. Somewhere in the city a violin began, not sure of its key, testing a phrase that might have been a farewell or the start of something stubborn enough to live. He let the sound pass through him, and then sit quietly beside his thoughts. Tomorrow, the embassy would arrive with its polished concerns. Tonight, the inspector set his palm on the envelope from Venice and kept it there until the paper felt warm. They sent a car, of course. Not one of the city's practical cabs with their honest leather smell, but a consular machine with polished doors and discreet curtains, the driver's cap sitting like a verdict above the collar. It idled outside the Quai des Orfèvres, as if time itself were being chauffeured. The porter poked his head into Maigray's office and announced the visitor with the careful neutrality of a man lowering a fragile object onto a shelf. The attaché from the letter arrived first, grey suit immaculate, umbrella furled without shedding a single drop, as if even the rain took instructions from his sleeve. Behind him came the envoy, no title given, which is how one knew he had more than one. He was 50 if the day were kind, a face built to be remembered only in portraits, smooth where life had tried to chip it. He offered his hand with the genial weight of an obligation and sat without asking, as men do who are confident the chair is already theirs. "We are grateful for your diligence, Inspector," he began in careful French, whose warmth had been trained, not born. "It is our regret that a citizen of ours should come to grief in your hospitable city." The room smelled of damp wool and the sweetish ghost of last night's pipe. Maigret let the envoy's words settle like dust. "She has a name now," he said. "Clara Morini. She will be buried under it." "Indeed," the envoy replied, as though the matter of a grave had been satisfactorily arranged by the mere mention of one. He placed a thin leather dossier on the desk and rested 2 fingers upon it. "There is, however, a small delicacy." Delicacies in diplomacy are always large things dressed as petits fours. Maigret waited. The envoy opened the dossier to reveal very little. One photograph clipped to a typed page, a card with an embossed crest, a letter whose lines had been more heavily considered than its content required. He turned the photograph towards the inspector. A younger Clara, the clarity of her eyes not yet compromised by sleeplessness, stood between 2 men in tails on a theatre's small stage. One of the men was unmistakably the husband Bianchi, his gaze already married to the violin case at his feet. The other wore a smile he had practiced upon mirrors meant for kings. "You recognize neither of the gentlemen, perhaps?" the envoy said pleasantly. "The one to her left is Enrico Bianchi, yes. The one to her right is the reason I ride in cars before noon." He named him then, a count without a province, a patron without a profession, one of those figures the public sees only when it is asked to applaud. He had financed provincial festivals and allowed his crest to warm theatre programs that otherwise would have shivered. Men like him wrote cheques as if blotting out their own boredom. Men like him sometimes believed voices could belong to them. "He is not the husband," Maigret said. "The husband is unimportant," the envoy said, with the mildness of a dagger in a drawer. "The Count is invested in the memory of Signora Morini. He would be distressed to see his name in any report that might be copied, perhaps discussed, perhaps misunderstood. You know how the press, in any capital sniffs." That the attaché performed a small, elegant cough and folded his hands as if to keep them from fidgeting. Outside the window, a barge's horn gave a short complaint, then settled. The river went on doing its work without conferences. "Why would his name appear at all?" Maigret asked. He did not pull her from the water. He did not place her in it. The envoy breathed through his nose, an economical sound, like a man measuring out his patience in teaspoons. Because grief travels with luggage, Inspector. There are letters, there were visits, there is a liaison, retired perhaps, but not dismissed. The Count believes he helped her with generosity that asks no thanks. If her last months were untidy, he would prefer not to see his handkerchief waved from any window. There were two Claras in Paris, Maigret said. You may be protecting the wrong one. The envoy's smile did not waver, but the skin above his cheekbones tightened as if in a draught. I trust you will protect them both, he said. What we request, what we must request, is very small. That in the official account this be a private tragedy with no public names. Husband unknown, pass silent. A fall not worth a headline. Janvier appeared in the doorway with the instinct of a man who has learned to hear tones as well as words. At a glance from his chief, he withdrew, closing the door softly. In the corridor, a typist laughed once at something, and then, remembering where she was, became quiet again. It is already a private tragedy, Maigret said. And yet the city will gossip whether we give it permission or not. Gossip dies when it is not fed, the envoy murmured. And sometimes it is better for the living that the dead do not shout. He reached for the leather dossier and slid a card from its sleeve. It bore a telephone number attached to a residence near Parc Monceau, where curtains were trained to fall exactly so. If you require reassurance, he said, the Count will receive you reluctantly and will be grateful afterward. He is leaving for Vienna day after tomorrow. Trains are so awkward when the papers misbehave. They stood. Hands were offered and clasped with practiced pressure. In the doorway, the envoy paused and allowed a flicker of something less lacquered to show. She had a beautiful voice, he said quietly. Men who cannot sing sometimes imagine they own the air. Then the mask came down. Good day, Inspector. The consular car slid away like a well-placed lie. Maigret stood a moment longer with his palm flat on the desk, feeling the texture of the wood, as one might read a braille message from past cases. Lucas eased his head around the doorframe. Shall I prepare a statement for the press that says nothing? Lucas asked. Prepare one, Maigret said. Then lock it in a drawer and tell them to call back tomorrow. He put on his coat and walked. The morning had lifted itself out of the river, the fog thinner than the day before, like an old shirt finally drying. He took the long route by the bridges, past a bookseller laying out damp volumes that smelled faintly of mushrooms. A pianist practiced in an open window, repeating a 4-bar phrase until it began to resemble a question. The address near Parc Monceau waited like a well-fed cat. He rang and was admitted by a butler whose face had been ironed flat of expressions. The salon resembled an embassy's waiting room, even if it pretended to be a home. Gilding, a carpet that forgave footsteps, a portrait of a horse painted as if it had served the Republic personally. The Count came in with his smile already attached, but it faltered when he saw the inspector's hat remained in his hands and not in his own. Inspector, the Count said, offering perfumed fingers. To what do I owe? No, I know, it is dreadful. Utterly. I'm devastated. People who speak in adverbs often expect absolution as a receipt. Maigret did not sit. He allowed the Count to feel the weight of a man who would stand through polite discomforts. You knew Clara Morini, he said. The real one? The Count's eyes performed a small theatre. Knew? We were acquainted through art. I support the arts as one supports bridges, so useful for everyone. A benefaction, not a relationship. She had a trunk at the Gare de Lyon, Maigret said. There were letters, One refers to a man whose generosity was not to be discussed. That could be any man, the Count said with cheerful contempt for coincidence. These poor creatures always know a little kindness. They collect it like pins. Maigret let silence widen the space between them. Beneath the salon's polish, faint as dust, lay the smell of money left too long in boxes. Finally, the Count sighed, a man yielding an inch because he had thousands of acres left. "Very well," he said. "For a season. How long is a season? I saw that she could use what the world had used up. I paid certain debts. I arranged occasionally a supper where music might be played without a bill. That is not a scandal, it is charity with taste. I did not drown her, Inspector, and I will not be drowned with her." "You are not in danger of that," Maigret said. "The water chooses differently." The Count's gaze flicked to a mantel where a photograph sat in a silver frame. A woman whose beauty had been instructed posed with a small dog that was braver than both of them. "Please tell your newspapers that I am a friend of music," he said. "It is a sentence that offends nobody." When Maigret left, the butler's eyes followed him to the door with a look that had not been trained out entirely. Pity, perhaps, or the envy of a man whose secrets would never interest a policeman. He walked away from the district of softened voices towards streets where the wind carried the smell of onion soup and damp corduroy. At a café on a corner, he took a table by the window and allowed a bowl to steam the lenses of his patients. The Count had not killed her. He had simply arranged her fatigue in more comfortable rooms. But there had been a tremor when her name passed his mouth, a small chink where self-love met memory. Not guilt, an ache, like a man probing a tooth he will not have pulled. At the quay, he found Janvier holding a scrap of information like a bird he feared to crush. "A porter at the Hôtel de l'Europe remembers the husband," Janvier said. "An Italian with careful shoes, asked for a room that faced the canal, paid for 2 nights, left after 1. "When?" Maigret asked. "The night before the body rose," Janvier said. They went at once. The hotel had thin walls with thick wallpaper and a clerk who kept his ledger as if it might one day testify against him. The room that had faced the canal offered a view of iron railings and the slow muscularity of barges. On the sill, a faint oval where something had rested, a case perhaps, a hat, a conscience. Maigret opened the wardrobe out of habit and found a smell that did not belong to the hotel's usual perfumes. Violin rosin, a soft sting like a memory that prefers the nose to the eye. He touched the oval on the sill with his thumb and carried a smear of dust away as souvenir and argument. "Send a man to the stations," he said to Janvier. "Not to find him yet, to feel whether he is leaving or pretending to leave." Evening leaned against the windows. The press called twice. Lucas parried them with the swords of vague phrases and blessed delay. At 7, Madame Maigret telephoned, the wire carrying warmth better than officials did. "You will not eat if I do not remind you," she said, which was true and sufficient. He promised a plate somewhere and meant it. Before he left, he opened his desk's lower drawer where he had placed the lace, the letters, the trunk's small tin. He added to them the card from the Count and the attaché's polite warning. The drawer looked for a moment like a stage set for a play the audience would not be allowed to see. On his way out, he took the long step across the courtyard that always made him feel for an instant like a schoolboy released. The air had acquired that night's particular cold, an edge that made lamps appear more yellow. He turned toward the river, as he often did when choices had to be made with the heart, and then explained with the pen. On the Pont Marie, 2 lovers argued softly in a doorway. the man's hat pulled low, the woman's hand to her mouth as if to cork the words that wanted to spill. In the water below, a thread of light travelled on a ripple and disappeared where the current accepted it. He stopped midway across and leaned on the stone, pipe unlit in his palm. The Count wanted namelessness, the embassy wanted quiet, the husband wanted absence that looked like decency. The living Clara wanted to go on wearing a borrowed name until it felt like skin. And what did he want? Only this, that the dead woman should not be explained to suit the comfort of men who had not been cold in a long time. A footstep approached and stopped a respectful distance away. Lucas's voice, low and steady, came through the dark. "Let's talk in the cafes, Chief, not headlines, whispers. They say a diplomat kept a singer who forgot how to sing. They say the police will look the other way." "Let them say," Maigret answered. "Tomorrow we will bury her. After that, the city will find a new cruelty. Our task is to place the truth where it can be found later when someone has the courage to look." Lucas grunted, not disagreeing. "And the husband?" "Near," Maigret said, "as near as a man can be to what he cannot forgive himself." They stood together a minute longer, two shapes on a bridge, the river moving under their silence. Then Lucas went back toward the lamps, and Maigret remained, gazing at the black ribbon that had bound Venice to Paris and Clara to them all. When he finally turned for home, a thin music came with him along the quay. No tune, only the resinous breath of a bow testing strings. Somewhere, in a room that faced the water, a man was deciding which part of his story he would allow to live. The inspector walked on, feeling the weight and the lightness of secrets inside his coat, and knew the case had crossed its boundary. It was no longer merely a question of how a woman met the water. It had become the quieter inquiry the city always avoids. Who profits when a voice goes silent, and who is permitted to forget? He reached his door and put his key in the lock with a care that made no sound. Behind him, Paris lifted its face to the night as if expecting a confession. The quay was quieter than usual that morning, as though the building itself were withholding its breath. The clerks spoke in half voices, typewriters hesitated between strokes, and even the phones rang with a kind of apology. Outside, the Seine slid by, flat and grey as polished lead, the barges moving slow and heavy like thoughts one could not quite abandon. Maigret stood at his window with his hands behind his back, pipe unlit, staring at the water. The fog of the past days had finally broken, but the light it left behind was pale and uncertain, the colour of paper left too long in a drawer. Behind him, the desk bore the marks of his patience, reports written, rewritten, and never quite finished. A single folder lying open with the name Morini, Clara, in his own deliberate hand. Janvier entered quietly, his coat unbuttoned, the morning cold still clinging to him. "Lucas says the Count has left Paris," he announced. "Train for Vienna as promised. No press at the station, no questions." Maigret turned, the faintest of smiles tugging at his mouth. "Men like him don't leave. They merely change their address." Janvier nodded, uncertain whether to agree or remain loyal to silence. "And Bianchi?" "No trace," Maigret said. "But that was expected. He'll stay close enough to see her buried, far enough to disappear afterward." He gestured toward the chair opposite the desk. "Sit. There's something in this case that doesn't quite settle. Not a missing fact. Facts are easy. It's the tone of it. The rhythm." Janvier frowned slightly. "Rhythm, Chief?" "Yes," Maigret said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Every case has its rhythm. Some move fast, impatient, full of noise and motion. Others, like this one, drag their feet as if reluctant to reach the end. There's a kind of mercy in slowness, you know. It gives guilt time to ripen." Janvier shifted in his seat, his notebook unopened. He had learned that Maigret didn't need shorthand when he was speaking this way. What he needed was company. "I've been thinking," Maigret continued, "about how the dead woman kept her dignity even in death, the lace at her wrist, the neatness of her coat. She went to the water not like someone fleeing, but like someone returning home." He paused, the room filled with the faint hum of the building's pipes. "Do you know, Janvier, there's a kind of silence that follows some people around all their lives. It's not loneliness exactly, more like a shadow that absorbs the noise others make. Clara Marini lived in that kind of silence, and when her voice left her, she simply stepped into it." Janvier looked down at his hands. "And the husband?" Maigret's expression softened. "He's a man whose punishment began the moment she disappeared. He doesn't need us for that." He moved toward the desk and began sorting through the contents of the folder. The letters from Venice, the telegrams, the Count's visiting card, the photograph of the two Claras beside the piano. He touched each object as though reacquainting himself with ghosts. The door creaked, and Lucas appeared, a mug of coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. "They've printed it, Chief," he said. "Small column, 3rd page, singer's tragic end in the Canal, possible suicide. No mention of names. The embassy must have been pleased." Maigret accepted the paper, glanced at the headline, and set it aside without reading further. "A short article for a long life," he murmured. "That's one mercy among many." Lucas hesitated. "The funeral's this afternoon. The parish priest at St. Paul agreed to say a few words, said it was too sad a story for an empty church." Maigret nodded. "We'll go." The rest of the morning passed in fragments, half-finished reports, telephone calls, a brief visit from a journalist turned away with polite indifference. The city beyond the windows went on living as it always did, footsteps on bridges, engines along the quays, the slow grind of commerce and habit. But within the walls of the Quai des Orfèvres, the world seemed to have narrowed to a single point. One woman's name and the faint trace of her voice lingering in the air. When the time came, Maigret walked the short distance to the church on foot. The air carried the smell of wet stone and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. Inside, the church was dim, the stained glass dull with soot. Only a few benches were occupied, Lucas, Janvier, the undertaker's men, and one woman sitting apart with her hat pulled low. Clara, the living shadow of the dead. The coffin was small, unadorned, a thin spray of lilies on top. The priest spoke briefly, his words more for the living than the departed, and the sound of them echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling like ripples spreading in shallow water. Maigret stood at the back, hands clasped behind him, eyes fixed on the coffin. The faint smell of incense mixed with the dust of the pews, and he thought, not for the first time, that death had a way of restoring dignity to those whom life had humiliated. When the service ended, he waited until the others had filed out. Clara approached him, her steps slow, her gloved hands trembling slightly. "It was kind of you to come, Monsieur Maigret," she said. "Not many would." "It's part of my work," he answered. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't. Not this part." For a moment they stood in silence, the air thick with the faint echo of the organ's last note. Then she reached into her bag and drew out a sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this," she said. "He sent it last night, before leaving." Maigret accepted it, his fingers brushing hers. "He's gone then?" "Yes." "He said he would take a train heading south, maybe to the sea? He didn't say which one." He nodded. "Good. The sea has more forgiveness than the law." When she turned to leave, her perfume lingered in the cold air like the last memory of spring. Back at the quay, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet written in Bianchi's restrained hand. "Inspector, I promised her once that I would not let her vanish without witness. You have done that for me. There is nothing else left to add except this. Some people are born to be echoes and others to be the walls that receive them. I thank you for being the latter." E.B. Maigret folded the letter carefully, placed it with the others, and locked the drawer. The click of the key sounded final. Then he crossed to the window once more. The light outside had begun to fade, leaving the water below dull and expressionless. He could see his own reflection in the glass. The heavy face, the pipe, the overcoat that had known too much weather. The city, indifferent as ever, moved beneath him. And yet, somewhere within its labyrinth of streets and secrets, a trace of music persisted. Faint, elusive, like the hum of memory through stone. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and watched the smoke rise in slow spirals toward the ceiling. "Echoes," he murmured. "That's all it ever is." Then he turned from the window and began, methodically, to clear his desk for the night. The train to Saint-Cloud cut through the morning like a sigh held too long. The city receded behind Maigret in layers of smoke and memory, the bridges, the warehouses, the spires half erased by mist. Beyond Suresnes, the air grew cleaner, edged with winter. Even the Seine there seemed to breathe more freely, unburdened by the gossip of barges. He sat alone, pipe unlit, the folded letter from Bianchi in his pocket. The words had settled in him like sediment, dull but enduring. Some people are born to be echoes. When he stepped onto the platform, the quiet startled him. No shouting porters, no vendors, only the hollow rhythm of water striking stone. The small station smelled of cold iron and wood polish. A cab waited outside, its driver drowsing under a blanket. "Villa Mirabeau," Maigret said, and the man tipped his cap, setting the horse into motion with a weary click of the tongue. The road wound upward through bare trees. The fog had thinned, but not vanished, softening the villas into silhouettes that seemed to hover above the ground. He knew the place, an artist's refuge, a pocket of privilege where widows painted and men of means pretended to be forgotten. He had seen it before, in other winters, when certain names preferred to weep privately. At the gate of the villa the caretaker waited, hat in hand, his expression the studied vacancy of servants who had learned that truth was never part of their wage. "Monsieur Bianchi?" Maigret asked. "Inside, Inspector. He's been expecting you since dawn." The house smelled faintly of wax and damp canvas. Paintings leaned against the walls, unfinished seascapes, all grey water and pale horizons. A fire murmured in the hearth, but the room remained cold, as though the warmth had chosen not to linger. By the window stood Enrico Bianchi, still in the same dark coat, the collar turned up, the violin case open beside him on the table. "You came," Bianchi said. His voice was soft, hoarse, stripped of pretense. "I would have, even without the letter," Maigret replied. Bianchi gestured toward the fire. "I have nothing new to tell you, only what should have been said sooner. Sit, if you wish. It may take time to find the right words." Maigret remained standing, pipe in his hand. "Take your time. I have the patience for it." For a while, Bianchi said nothing. He walked to the table, opened the violin case, and took out the instrument. It was an old one, the varnish worn thin along the edges, the strings dulled from neglect. He drew the bow once across them, an uncertain note that filled the room with a trembling life. Then he set the violin down again. "She used to tune it for me," he said. Even when she stopped singing, she would listen to the sound and smile, as if the wood itself remembered what her voice had forgotten. You see, Inspector, the world applauded her when she sang, and punished her when she could no longer. Fame is cruel to those who do not know how to lie to it. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. When her illness came, I told her we would find another way. Teach, compose, anything. But she heard pity in every word I spoke. We quarrelled, quietly, at first. Then one evening, after a recital where she had sat among strangers, she said she wanted to breathe somewhere no one knew her name. Paris, she thought, would be kind to her anonymity. His gaze drifted over the garden, where frost glimmered on the hedges. I let her go, that was my crime. Not murder, permission. I followed later, not to reclaim her, but to make sure she lived. And when I found her again, she had already become someone else, another Clara, one who laughed too loudly and wore lilac to hide the smell of fear. I waited near the canal that night. She saw me, she smiled. Then she walked past me, and I thought she meant to return home. I was wrong. He turned, meeting Maigray's eyes. She didn't fall. She stepped forward as if greeting someone. Perhaps it was peace. I heard the splash. I didn't move. I told myself she might surface. But she didn't. And I understood finally that she had chosen a place where my love could no longer follow. Maigray's voice was gentle. And afterward? I carried her name to the police, Bianchi said. I wanted her to be found, but not claimed. Then I went to the cafe, to the room above it. I waited to see whether anyone would look for her. When you did, I felt a kind of relief, though I knew it would end here. He sat heavily in the armchair, the violin across his knees like a confession written in wood. The Count will deny everything. The embassy will smooth it over, and the papers will find another corpse. But you, Inspector, you will remember her as more than a tragedy, won't you? Maigret drew on his pipe, though it was unlit. The gesture alone steadied him. I'll remember her as a woman who refused to let her silence be decided by others. And you as the man who mistook that silence for surrender. Bianchi smiled faintly. That's fair. He opened the violin case once more, placed the instrument inside and closed it with deliberate care. I've written a letter for her friend in Venice. It says she found peace. That's a lie, of course, but a gentle one. He reached into his pocket, drew out a small envelope, and placed it on the table beside the inspector. There's also a ticket for the southbound train tonight. I won't take it. It's better this way. Maigray's eyes narrowed. Better? Don't look so alarmed, Bianchi said, almost amused. I'm not theatrical. I'll go to the bridge when it's dark. I'll stand where she stood, and I'll wait until the fog comes back. I don't imagine we'll meet again. She's too far beyond forgiveness. But I might at least share her. Silence. Maigret stepped forward, his tone even. You could still leave. Venice would take you back. There's always work for a musician. Bianchi shook his head. A musician needs rhythm, Inspector. Mine stopped the night hers did. The clock on the mantel ticked, each second a quiet footstep toward the inevitable. Maigret felt the futility of argument press against his ribs. He had seen this calm before, in prisoners who had decided their sentence before the judge could. You'll stay here until evening, Maigret said finally. Promise me that much. Bianchi gave a small bow, the kind a performer offers after the last applause. Until evening, then. Maigret left the villa as the fog began to gather again, thin threads rising from the river banks like smoke from invisible fires. He walked back to the station, his coat heavy, his heart heavier. The train ride to Paris was brief and silent. When he reached his office, Lucas looked up from his typewriter. Everything finished, Chief? Maigret didn't answer immediately. He set the envelope on his desk, its seal unbroken, and stared at it as if it might speak. "Almost," he said at last. That night, long after the lamps along the Seine had blurred into gold smudges, a fisherman at Saint-Cloud heard a single note carried across the water, thin, trembling, then gone. He looked up, but there was only the fog and the river, each holding the other like a promise. When the news reached Maigret in the morning, he read it without surprise. "A man found drowned near the bridge," the report said. "No papers. A violin case floating close by." He folded the sheet once, twice, then set it gently atop the drawer that held the rest of the story. He did not lock it this time. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the Seine, and for a moment it seemed to him that the river had learned how to keep its own secrets. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and watched the smoke curl upward until it dissolved into nothing. The day they buried her was one of those Paris days that never quite arrive, a grey that refused noon, a chill that idled rather than bit, a light that seemed to come from the stone itself. Maigret walked from the Ile Saint-Louis toward the little cemetery as if he were following the river upstream, hat low, pipe unlit, the weight of damp air upon his shoulders. There were few mourners, the undertaker's men in their black economy, a priest who spoke like a man who remembered his catechism better than his sins, Janvier and Lucas with their hands in their pockets, and at the edge, beneath a plane tree, the woman who had kept the second Clara alive long enough for the first to be buried. No band, no wreaths with ribbons like lies, only lilies with the good manners to die without spectacle. The coffin went down with the modest sound of wood agreeing to earth. The priest offered words that were more about the living than the dead. Maigret listened without, hearing, his gaze on the disturbed soil that even now tried to look as if it had never been asked to open. When the last clod fell and the men tamped the mound into quietness, a small wind moved across the cemetery and turned the edges of the grass. He had the sense, irrational and precise, that Paris had exhaled. He lingered. The others drifted away in pairs, their footsteps making the briefest argument with gravel. Only Clara remained, gloved hands folded, face composed into the kind of calm that is learned and not given. She did not look at the grave. She looked at the road that led back to the city, as if measuring the distance she would have to carry what was left. When at last she spoke, it was not to him but to the air. "In Venice," she said, "we say the water keeps the truth at the bottom and gives the rest to the sky." Then she turned, and the lilac he had come to recognize followed her a step and then gave up, letting the colder air win. He did not stop her, neither did he offer comfort. There are comforts that cancel understanding, and those he had learned to avoid. The embassy telephoned that afternoon to express satisfaction that the matter had not become theatrical. A clerk spoke the envoy's courtesy in smaller syllables and promised that interested persons would remain grateful for the police's restraint. Maigret thanked him in the tone one uses for directions already known. He put down the receiver and stared at the black earpiece as one might study a beetle one has decided not to crush. On his desk lay the letters from Venice, the Count's card, the lace folded into its envelope, and the husband's last note like a breath held between pages. He closed the drawer and did not lock it. If the ministry wished to inventory his patients, let them. Some cases end with a file. This one asked to end with a silence properly shelved. Evening settled early, as if the day had miscounted its hours and decided to keep what remained. He walked without destination, the way a man walks when his boots remember for him. The Seine wagged its dull gleam beneath the bridges, the quays smoked with the breath of horses and men. A bookseller shut his stall and patted a damp stack as if the city could be kept dry by affection. When he reached the arsenal lock, he did not stop for ceremony. He leaned on the rail as he had on the first morning, a large man occupying little space, and looked where the water had first offered up the face that had changed the rhythm of a week. A barge nudged the wall and muttered an iron complaint. Somewhere a bell counted a number that refused to belong to a clock. The world around him had resumed its business with the indifference of a ledger. Yet, in the surface, a skin drawn over depths that remembered, there was that same reluctance to clarify. The canal wore its colour like a secret well kept. He thought of the Count's salon with its carpets that forgave footsteps, the envoy's card with a number that rang behind velvet, the care in Bianchi's hand when he folded mercy into untruth, the second Clara's poise that splintered only in doorways. He thought of Madame Maigret at the table under the yellow lamp, needle darting, saying that this would not end in handcuffs but in understanding. He thought of the way the morgue's ledger had softened when a name finally occupied its line. Names matter to the living. Water is content with weight. He imagined, not for the first time, the other city, Venice, its corridors of water where sound goes to learn to be echo, where a singer could step out of a theatre and travel by silence, where a husband might find himself on a bridge too old to care for modern despair. He imagined the bottom of those canals, a library of silted truths, a museum of refusals. Silence, he thought, is not empty, it is archived. He turned from the rail and walked the towpath. Paris was noisy enough now to disguise secrets as ordinary sentences, the call of a chestnut seller, a child corrected for tracking mud indoors, the hiss of lamps as they accepted their evening burdens. Yet behind the noise he heard the case's true music. Not the violin brought once more to the surface, not the throat that had failed in fog, but the steady hum of lives choosing the lives beside them. The Count choosing his portrait, the consulate choosing its discretion, the husband choosing a water that would not choose him back, the borrowed Clara choosing the narrow path between pity and survival, the city choosing to forget on schedule, and he, Jules Maigret, choosing to remember without fury, because fury changes nothing that sorrow has already arranged. At home, the apartment carried its habitual benevolence. The lamp threw its modest gold across the table. The stew, warmed a second time, tasted of patience. The radio told a story of a factory dispute and then a children's tale without pausing to change its tone. He ate with the appetite of a man who respects soup. Madame Maigret listened to his silence and smiled the way one smiles at a cat that refuses to admit it belongs to the house. "It's finished?" she said, not asking. "Yes," he answered, then amended. "As finished as these things ever are." She nodded. "Then tomorrow you will begin another that will look different and feel the same." They drank their coffee without hurry. When he rose, he kissed her hair and stood a moment at the window. The reflection there was the one he knew best. A large face softened by the city's habitual mercy, a pipe that glowed only when he remembered to be a man of habits. Night has its own rules at the Quai des Orfèvres. The corridors lose their impatience, the wood absorbs the memory of hands, the windows affiliate with the dark. He returned there because the case had asked to end not at a grave or a rail, but at the desk where the story had learned its shape. He sat, opened the drawer, and removed the lace. Under the lamp, it kept its modest brilliance, a thread of Venice caught in Paris like a rumour that had chosen a better city. He placed it beside the map and set the husband's note above it, the two objects leaning against each other like neighbours on a bench. Then he began the last report, not the ministry's version that had already been posted through the pipes of the Republic, but the report that would live in his own file with its private index. He wrote slowly, without drama. Woman, Clara Morini. Time, between midnight and 2. Place, Arsenal Lock. Cause, drowning, voluntary in its first motion, involuntary thereafter, as bodies are persuaded by weight. Associated names, 1 husband, uncharged, 1 patron, unmentioned, 1 embassy, satisfied, 1 witness, living on Rue du Temple under a borrowed spring. He stopped, stared, smiled at the impertinence of adding weather to law, and wrote anyway. Atmosphere, fog, smell, lilac, sound, a violin deciding against a second note. He closed the folder. He did not bind it tight. Some stories must breathe in cupboards to remain true. He stood and crossed to the window where the river made its uncertain offering to the night. Lights lay themselves upon it like tired men on hard beds. He remembered the fisherman's report from Saint-Cloud, the single note heard and then denied by the fog, and felt grateful for the witness. Most cases end in rooms with no windows. This one had chosen both cities and 2 waters and 3 kinds of love. That was untidy and thus more accurate than the tidy tragedies people posture toward. He left the office by the courtyard because he preferred stones to staircases when he carried weight. In the archway, the porter raised a hand and lowered it again, as if to wave at someone one must pretend not to know. On the quay, the night had come to terms with itself. He walked without company toward the river and stopped midway across a bridge whose name had the memory of kings and saints. Below him, the water wore its darkness well. He thought of the bottom of the Grand Canal. The phrase had arrived in his mind on the first morning and refused to leave, as a place where truths eventually abandon their disguises and lie down together. He felt no compulsion to look over too long. The dead ask less of us than the living. They request only accuracy and the decency of silence. A final thing remained, though he could have left it. He turned from the parapet and followed the quays until the Café des Artistes glowed like a small ship that had decided not to sail. Inside, the violinist tuned without intention. The waiter nodded as one nods to weather. At the back table, the woman who had been Clara long enough to teach Paris the shape of her restraint sat with a coffee she was not drinking. He did not approach. He let the room be what it was. The door opened. A man without importance entered. A laugh, unmoored from context, rose and fell. He stepped out again into the honest cold and felt it take his face in its sensible hands. At the corner, he stopped, lit his pipe, and watched the match flare human in the wind. The smoke rose and thinned as all testimonies do. He imagined the long line of cases behind him, the thieves who wanted to be believed, the killers who wanted to be understood, the husbands who wanted the world to translate their remorse into absolution, the women who had been asked to live louder than their strength, and he knew, with the calm of a man in the right work, that the law could not answer most of what had been asked of it. But the law could witness. It could write a name where there had been a blank. It could enter Clara Morini in a ledger that would outlast men who could not bear to see their names beside hers. It could keep, in a drawer the ministry never audits, a scrap of lace that, under a lamp, still remembered a wrist. He crossed the bridge once more and did not look down. The city had given him back the shape of its indifference, and he had given it, in return, the courtesy of not dramatizing what was already theatre. When he reached his door, he paused, allowed the night to finish saying what it needed to say, and then went in quietly, as if trying not to wake someone. Madame Maigret had left the lamp on, not out of worry, but as one leaves a book open to the page where the story will resume. He sat, removed his hat, and set the lace on the table a moment before putting it away. The apartment accepted the object without comment. The clock, which kept time for itself and not for men, moved its hand a notch. Sleep took him the way a careful nurse takes a child, firmly, without negotiation. And in that last awareness before the room closed, he saw the canal once more, not Paris now, but its elder, the long, green corridor where even footsteps learn to float. At the bottom, where truth is heavier than rumour, he saw nothing because that is what the bottom offers, the decency of keeping what it is given. The water above it held a single tremor, as if a bow had been tested and then lowered, and Paris, lifting its morning somewhere beyond the night, prepared to carry other names while this one sank to the right place.